Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Lessons from the Laboratory, Optimizing Your Tissue Processing. I am Kaylee Bach of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by Leica Biosystems. To learn more, visit leicabiosystems.com. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. You may also submit any technical issues here as well if you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation. And with that, I'd like to now welcome our speaker, Robin Fitzl, Senior Field Application Specialist at Leica Biosystems. For a complete biography on our speaker, please click on the Presenter tab. Robin, thank you for joining us. You may now begin your presentation.
And thank you for that introduction. This webinar, entitled Tissue Processing Artifacts, will discuss how to optimize your tissue processing and recognize the cause of common artifacts. The learning objectives for this webinar are as follows. Discuss pre-analytics and the impact of improper fixation and artifacts on tissue processing. Discuss fixation and the impact of incomplete fixation on tissue processing. We're going to describe the impact of improper prosection, which is actually the dissection and sampling of tissue, and determine satisfactory processing of samples. Last but not least, we're going to explain why routine maintenance is a critical success factor to proper tissue processing. This slide has two examples of what the ideal sections in a perfect world would look like under the microscope. The skin section on the left is clean, with the eosin staining the components of the dermis with different shades. The colon section on the right is crisp and has well-defined nuclei. You can see some of the cells even contain mucin. There is no background staining or muddiness to the stain. This is a perfect example. One artifact seen in the lab that is not uncommon is crush artifact. You can see that the lung section on the left is architecturally preserved, while the section on the right has mild compression at the bottom center. The staining, although not ideal on the right, is okay, but you cannot see some of the alveolar sacs like you can on the left. The cause of this artifact could be maybe compressing too hard with blunt forceps. One way to optimize and to avoid this artifact is to exhibit care when handling these type of tissues. This is an example of mild artifact. A little bit more severe situation in this sample would be, as you can see again on the left, is an architecturally preserved section of lung, while on the right is a section of lung that has moderate crush artifact. In a severe example, you can see again on the left, we have a well-preserved section of lung, while on the right, near the top left corner, you can see that there is crush artifact that actually has caused nuclear streaming. An artifact that is commonly seen is cauterization. You can see a normal section of breast tissue on the left that shows connective tissue evenly staining, while on the right, the section, although it is lighter, near the top center is an area that is darker. If you were able to go down on higher power, the nuclear detail would either be absent or unclear. Cauterization oftentimes cannot be controlled in histology, as it is a part of the surgical resection procedure to remove the tissue, but it is good in this slide to at least recognize it. An artifact common in the research world are perfusion artifacts. I know that this is a technique that's vital to whole organ fixation in research, and for optimal results, care must be taken to avoid architectural damage to the tissue. You can see here that the section on the left of lung shows the normal architecture, where on the right, the spaces are more open, more wide, that indicates there's been damage by perfusion. The next two slides will demonstrate the results of little or no fixation and result in degrees of autolysis. The section on the left is a beautiful section of kidney. Here you can see the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule, they components that are easily appreciated. In contrast, the kidney section on the right, where the architecture is preserved, but the cellular details are scant. This would be considered mild autolysis because there are areas where the nuclei can be seen. There's a little, you can still identify tubules, but it's not as nice as the section on the left. Here we have a nice section of liver on the left. You can see the hepatocytes with nuclei that have well-defined nuclei and sinusoids containing RBCs. While the section of liver on the right is an example of severe autolysis. The architecture is not only skewed, but there is little or no cellular detail. Let's move on to another artifact that deals with contamination. The next three slides will show examples of such. On this section of brain, you can see by the red arrow that it's been contaminated with plant material. On this slide, the section of lung has been contaminated with a section of liver tissue. Here we have a section of cardiac tissue contaminated with a small fragment of thyroid. To optimize all of these contaminant scenarios shown here in the last three slides, it is best to avoid these types by keeping the dissection tools one uses and the space where the dissection occurs clean. Formalin pigment is another artifact that occurs in the lab, and it is when formalin is not buffered. To optimize, it is ideal to either make up or purchase formalin that is buffered at a pH of 7.2. This is a section of bone that has been properly decalcified. Here you can see the detailed structures such as the compact bone, bone marrow, trabeculi, and the periosteum. Contrasting to that section is an under-decalcified section of bone that results in areas that are thicker and that stain darker. Of course, the opposite of under-decalcification is over-decalcification. Again, on the section on the left is even and well stained, and the structures are easily identified. On the right, you can see a section of bone that has been over-decalcified. Over-decalcification also can adversely affect your IHC, such as kappa and lambda, that would not work with this section. Be aware that decalcification solutions, whether they're purchased or they're formulated in the lab, are harsh, usually acidic. So monitoring the process of the time needed to get to the endpoint where you can get a section is necessary, but being mindful of that time is important so that you not only have good histology when it comes to H&E, but that your IHC results are good too. Let's turn the tables and have it be your turn. Can you tell me what can cause these type of artifacts? Let's discuss the first one. In the histology lab, when tissue is submitted for processing, the cassettes are designed to hold sections that are no more than 2.5 by 2 centimeters in length and in width. The thickness, though, should not exceed more than 3 millimeters. Here, the section appears to have the correct length and width, but the cross-hatching of the section indicates that the section was way too thick. The second artifact I showed you is due to sponges in the cassette that are sometimes necessary for tissue that is very small, or tissue samples that are mixed with blood or mucinous material. But sponges too can also cause artifacts that can be seen here. When we have appropriate fixation, the result is this beautiful section of colon. You can see that it again is clear. There is no background staining. There's no muddiness of the stain. The nuclei are well defined. All the structures here are clean and crisp. In order to get these type of sections that turn out great, as in the previous slides shown, one key ingredient is fixation. The standard rule for fixation is usually 20 parts of fixative to 1 part tissue, not the reverse, as you can see with this image. That clearly gives you an example of what not to do. Let's talk about zonal fixation. So you may have the right ratio of formalin to the specimen, but if you have hollow organs or large tissue resections, you want to make sure that the hollow organ is open and that a large specimen is prepped so that the fixation can occur throughout the specimen. This is a side view through uterus. So you can see that about the outer half has formalin fixation, but the endometrial canal also looks like there's a submucosal fibroid there, has a little bit too much red pink appearance to it, which indicates to me that not only has fixation not reached this area, but it also looks like it might have some beginnings of autolysis. When we look at it under the microscope, you can see here the section on the left it would be an example of good fixation. This is decent staining, where on the right, you can see there's already some breakdown of that gland. So we know that shrinkage occurs at every stage of processing, but the harshest by far, of course, is ethanol. Here is the result of tissue not being completely fixed by formalin and then being placed in alcohol. The sections on the left-hand side are examples of ideal liver and kidney, while on the right, these sections, the fixation step has been completed by alcohol. There is excessive shrinkage and hardness of the tissue, which makes it more difficult to section. And usually on the microtome, you might see thick and thin sections where you might end up on the slide with a thicker section than usual. Usually you're cutting anywhere from 3 to 5 microns. And so the stain is going to be heavier. Also here, and this is a whole nother subject, but when you have overfixation and overprocessing, you have the possible loss, of course, of bound water. This is an artifact of an example of buffered salts. This is an extreme example of the salts making it all the way through the processor to the paraffin block, but you can see by the red arrows scattered, actually this is on the left-hand side, is numerous holes that indicate that buffered salts are in the tissue. This occurs when neutral buffered formalin, and usually the following alcohol is above 72, 73%. There is an acid-base reaction that causes the buffered salts to precipitate out. Going back to that beautiful section of colon, shows here again that it is clean and crisp. The nuclei are easily seen near the base of the cells. This is an idea of what we're looking at with appropriate dehydration. When tissue is over dehydrated, of course, shrinkage and loss of bound water can occur. The sections are then more difficult to cut and hydration with water is needed. These sections of bowel show chatter and some areas of darker staining. Take note that this section can represent more than one root cause. Remember, the section on the left is what we're going for. It has crisp staining with well-defined nuclei and cilia compared to the section on the right that is an example of severe over dehydration that not only results in chatter and darker staining, as we discussed in the previous slide, but also you can see these artifactual spaces. Here is that great section of bow that is evenly stained and structures well defined, contrasted to the one on the right that has been under dehydrated. Here you can see that the staining is murky, not well defined. That is because there is still free water present. Take note that this section can represent more than one root cause. Let's talk about appropriate clearing. Remember, this is the ideal section we want. The section is clean, crisp, evenly stained. Structures such as the nuclei are easily identified near the base of the cells. When tissue is overcleared, shrinkage and loss of bound water can also occur. That is because if xylene is used, it has a dehydrating characteristic much like alcohol. The sections again are then more difficult to cut and hydration might be needed. These sections, of course, show again chatter and some areas that are staining darker than they should. To minimize or even avoid overclearing, take in consideration not only how many steps of clearing that you have on your protocol, but also if there are temperatures on those steps that might be contributing to overclearing. Remember again that the section on the left is what we're going for. The section on the right is an example of overclearing that has not only resulted in chatter and dark staining, but also again, those artifactual spaces. Again, if xylene is used, it has that dehydrating characteristic like alcohol. So the sections are more difficult to cut. They can show the chatter and areas of dark staining. So be mindful of the steps of your clearing. Again, here is that wonderful section of bow on the left compared to the section on the right that has been undercleared. This section looks familiar, right? You can see that the staining again is murky, not well defined, and that is because there is still probably some water still present. Remember, I'm showing some of these sections in duplicate because you can have the same appearance but different root causes. Let's talk about wax infiltration. Remember, again, this is what we're going for. A nice section of bow that is clear, no background staining, no murkiness, everything is well defined. Again, here's that great section of bow, just to show you the contrast of a section on the right that shows incomplete wax infiltration. You can see the section is murky, not well defined, and looks familiar to previous slides I've shown you. Again, you can have this appearance on the right, but have several root causes. To avoid or to optimize to avoid this artifact, taking in consideration of the paraffin infiltration times might need to be considered. Also, too, you always want to have vacuum on your paraffin steps to pull out any residual xylene that might be in the tissue section. Let's talk about maintenance. Recollect that this is the ideal section we want, right? It's clean, it's clear, it's crisp. We've talked about some of the details. But I've saved the best for last because this, unfortunately, is an area that's so often dismissed. Remember, optimal histology sections are what we're targeting, right? Do these seem familiar? Yes. That is because if proper maintenance is not performed, residual water, dehydrants, and clearance can cause this type of poor histology seen on the right. Even if you don't have enough paraffin stations or vacuum on your paraffin that leaves a little bit of residual xylene in the tissue, this is the result of that too. As a final suggestion, working with your field application specialist and performing regularly scheduled preventive maintenance could optimize these processes. Leica has 14 specialists across the United States and a technical support center as well in the Chicago area. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Well, thank you, Robin, for your informative presentation. Before we begin our live Q&A session, I'd like to invite our audience to participate in a few poll questions. So our first question here asks, would you like Leica Biosystems to support you with any of the following? Check the best answer here. Our options are more product information only, request product demonstration, more product information, price quotation, request product demonstration, or no, I do not want to be contacted at this time. Again, our question asks, would you like Leica Biosystems to support you with any of the following? And we'll give you a moment to submit your answer. All right. Moving on to our next question here. When are you looking to purchase your tissue processing instrument? In more than 1 year, 1 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, or no purchase intent at this time? Again, the question asks, when are you looking to purchase your tissue processing instrument? Give you one more moment here. All right. We will move on now to our Q&A session. So I'd like to invite Robin to join me back here. And to our audience, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen, and we'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for. All right. So Robin, are you going to join us back on camera here?
Kaylee, I think I have thought I had turned myself back on. I
No problem.
apologize.
We got you here now. Perfect.
All
Okay,
right,
great.
that works. Thank you.
Awesome. We've got you here. All right, so let's get started. Again, to our audience, if you have a question that you'd like to ask that you haven't done so yet, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen, and we'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for. All right, so let's get started. Robin, my first question for you asks, what exactly does chatter mean?
Chatter can mean several things in histology, Kaylee. One of the things I had mentioned in the presentation that if tissue is overprocessed, of course, it becomes very dry, especially those types of tissue that don't have a lot of supporting fibrous or fatty tissue. A colon is a perfect example. Those small biopsies can become overprocessed, become too dry, and even with some hydration, you can't seem to get very far in before you have this chatter. Also, too, sections that are very dense, like bone, can cause chatter because as we cut, a lot of times we get in a hurry. We have several blocks we're trying to cut, and the speed at which we turn the wheel of the microtome can sometimes induce that factor too, where you'll see some chatter. Specimens that have a lot of blood, like placentas, can create chatter because blood has a tendency, even if you have a good tissue processing protocol, blood is a little tough to process because it already has a tendency to become a little bit more dry than it needs to be. Thank you for that.
And thank you for your answer, Robin. All right, moving on. This next question asks, why does my paraffin sometimes crumble when cutting?
Paraffin has a long shelf life, but it does have an expiration date. So if you have paraffin that has maybe not been kept in the laboratory, maybe subjected to high heats, or if it has been sitting around for a while, it does have an expiration date. So those could be factors that would cause the crumbling of the paraffin in your block when you're embedding.
Thank you, Robin.
Mhm.
All right. Now, next question here, will overfixed specimens affect IHC staining?
Absolutely. We like to see specimens fixed for 24 hours. Usually most facilities have that variation below that. I've seen 6, 10, 12,
but we try to reach that 24-hour mark. And once you go over that, what you're doing is building those cross links that help preserve the tissue. But just like a box that you're taping to send off to the post office, if you keep wrapping that tape around and around and around, it's similar to what you're doing to tissue, creating all those cross links that your antigen retrieval may not be able to get off once you're getting ready to do your IHC testing. So if you can leave it at 24 hours or below, certainly don't want to do under fixation, but if the closer you can get, the better IHC results you'll certainly achieve. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Robin.
Uh-huh.
All right. Now, if the xylene is heated for permeability purposes, is that a norm or is this a unique practice?
So I've been in histology for several decades, and it does seem like heat has been, along with pressure and vacuum on processors, has been the necessary, what I call the necessary evils of tissue processing. But now that we're in an age of doing not only IHC for the last 40 or 50 years in the laboratory, but now moving into in situ hybridization, where we are targeting RNA, it is even more critical to have a fresh look at how we tissue process. Because as we know, not only water, but also heat is the enemy of RNA. RNA is very delicate, tends to break down. So we at Leica have been looking at protocols, and certainly with your application specialists, you can work together to optimize protocols that can pull some of that heat off if you feel like it's going to interrupt or maybe skew the results on the ISH testing that you're doing in your laboratory. For sure. One of the areas of tissue processing that we'll never get away with heat, and I know everybody probably understands this, is your paraffin. But we can monitor the temperature at which we do infiltrate with paraffin. And there's different flavors of paraffin, I say, and it depends on the degree of plastic that's present in the paraffin. You can just look at whoever you purchase it from, they will have recommendations as to the paraffin temperature. Thank you for that. That's a great question.
Yes, thank you. All right. Now, moving on, when performing reagent change on process, is there an expiration date different from the container to the process bottle? Should it be noted on the bottle for CAP, or state regulation?
In the research site, that is a good question. I work on both sides. I work in clinical and in research, and it's a little bit different on the clinical side. But for research, if you're not processing every day, if you're not changing out those bottles every week, it may not, to be in compliance, you may be changing them so often it may not apply. But there are facilities that maybe only process once a month. And so then you do want to follow those regulatory requirements when it comes to labeling or to putting on not only your NFPA sticker, but also that expiration date. That would certainly be unique to every facility and the requirements that they have in place to the laboratory. Thank you for that. That's a great question.
Yes. All right. Now, is it good to store the paraffin samples uncut in the fridge for more than 6 months?
No. I'm trying to think of all the possibilities. The only special stain I can think about is amyloid. You probably want to coat the surface with paraffin. But when it comes to IHC, there are markers that are sensitive. It's not so much the temperature, but they are sensitive to the humidity in the refrigerator. So if you're going to store blocks, you might just want to put a thin coat of paraffin on top of that. With slides, if you're cutting slides that have, just your paraffin sections on the slide, they haven't been placed in the oven yet, that is fine too. But for ISH studies, there's documentation out there that recommends that you use them in less than 3 months. And so just because it's the moisture that tends to degrade the RNA. Hope that helps.
Great. Now, how long can we store fixed samples in ethanol? Does storing at 4C help? And can storing samples in PBS reverse fixation?
There's been a lot of controversy on this, and there's a lot of great peer-reviewed articles about what's the best time frame. We do know, of course, we just talked about whether it's PFA or neutral buffered formalin, the 10%, that we're looking to only go for 24 hours, because once you go beyond that, you get too many crosslinks and it's hard to break those down. There is discussion out there about being able to reverse that with a long PBS rinse, but I believe it's that the decision is still out for a final conclusion. I have my experiences in the clinical world, but being with Leica for the last 13 years, I've had a lot of discussion in the research arena about what they use and what they store their tissues in. And from my experience and what I've collected over the years is that 70% seems to be the ideal solution to hold specimens long-term in. That's a really good question, because I know that in research, they hold their tissue a lot longer than we do in the clinical world.
Yes. All right. Great. Thank you, Robin. And we've got
You are
time for a few
welcome.
more questions, and so many great
Sure.
questions coming in here. So we're going to continue. This next question I have for you asks, what is the time stability for prepared tissues?
Time stability for prepared tissue, would that be fixed or unfixed? Is that at the point of necropsy, or is kind of need to target that a little bit? Maybe I can talk about fresh tissue. Once you ligate, once you cut off the blood supply, we all know that the tissue is at that point on a molecular level, changes are happening. If you're doing IHC with particularly phosphorylated targets, you need to rapidly get that into some type of fixative, into PFA or MBF, and quickly. I think the time frame is less than 30 minutes. For other markers, they're a little bit harder. We look at getting the tissue fresh from the time you ligate to the time you get in to fix it for about an hour. I think it varies a little bit, maybe with some of the markers that are a little bit more sensitive, like HER2. There are some nuclear antibodies that tend to be a little bit sensitive too. So if you can keep in mind as quickly as possible, when you do whole organs, be sure, as you know, just like kidney and liver, they have this pseudo kind of capsule. Prostate has it, uterus, right? Anything that's going to be large where solution has to perfuse. If you're not going to use the perfusion tubing, you definitely want to make sure you make your sections, cut through that, or just nick the serosa so the solution can rapidly get in and do its job. That's good. Very good. Because on the basic end, this isn't rocket science, but I think a lot of times we get so busy, we kind of overlook the fundamentals. And if we can get the foundation right of getting the tissue fixed, getting it properly processed, everything downstream then doesn't have to be repeated, doesn't have to be troubleshooted, because everybody knows it can take a lot of your time to try to figure out where that root cause is, for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robin.
Yeah.
All right. Now, this user asks, sometimes sections do not catch the stains properly. Sections are understained apart from incomplete dewaxing. Are there any other reasons?
Yes. If the tissues have been fixed for longer than the 24-hour, if you've been holding it for a long time in PFA or in NBF, that can also affect your H&E staining. Kind of a trick that we've used in the laboratory is that we would just do antigen retrieval, and it would kind of release some of those cross links so that the hematoxylin would stain, and it brightens everything back up. If you're having trouble in your staining, then everything from once you've gotten, you've removed all of the wax, and that seems to be a factor. If you haven't, make sure your reagents are fresh, they've been changed, and then look at the particular stain. Maybe the staining time is not long enough. Especially on hematoxylin, it can age over time. So depending on how long you have used it for, you want to look at the recommendations in the literature that comes with whoever you're purchasing the hematoxylin from. Also depends on the type of hematoxylin. There are different flavors of hematoxylin. There's Harris, there's Weigert's, there's Mayer's. And so maybe that's a part of it. Maybe someone has replaced that bucket with a different type of hematoxylin, and it just doesn't look the same. It's going to be a little bit different a tone and hue of what, depending on if you used Harris versus Weigert's. Another thing too is if your eosin is not fresh, or if it's not at the right pH, that can affect the tissue picking up that stain and keeping it. Or if you have an alcohol following the eosin that is a little bit too diluted with water, because you're carrying over those racks, you can carry water over. And if you allow that to sit in there, water will leach out the eosin. So hopefully that helps kind of look at some areas of what you might be able to troubleshoot. All right. Good question.
Great. And we've still got plenty more, so we're going to keep moving here.
Let's do it. We've got time. Yeah.
Yes, we do. All right. This next one is a two-part question. If you have a large specimen sample, would you recommend to cut the specimen to increase fixation efficiency, or would extended time with a processor suffice? And the second part of this question asks, would the former method limit underfixation from occurring or autolysis?
So yes, there's probably yes, no. let me break it down. With large organs, especially if they're hollow and if they have a capsule, you want to, and a lot of times we're trying to, if you're dealing with tumor in a specific area, you need to know that location. We're trying to keep some architecture, right? So my experience has been, I was also a former PA, so I did a lot of dissection, is that we would try to at least open up as much as we could, keep it hinged so it's still together and you don't have a bunch of pieces floating around and you're trying to figure out where that came from or what was it sitting next to, that we would try to prep it as minimally as we could, but be able to create spaces where the fixation could get in and do its job, because right, you've cut off that blood supply. So now this, on a cellular level, we're going to see changes and we're going to start to see the beginning stages of autolysis, which in turn, it destroys your markers, RNA's gone, right? So we definitely want to take, and this is, I could talk about this all day long, because this is probably the most important step, is getting the specimen as quickly into the right fixative and for a good amount of time, but also allowing it to get to everything. We would actually take large specimens, keep the back half hinged, and just make 1 centimeter slices, and then we would place paper towels in those spaces so that it would allow the fixative to have a kind of a road to travel down to leach it into the specimen, so that it can start doing its job of creating those cross links to preserve not just the architecture, right, but the morphology. And then the other part of that question, Kelly, you might have to remind me.
Yes, the second part was, would the former method limit underfixation from occurring or autolysis?
Yeah, and I think I addressed that. Yeah. So yeah, if perfusion would be ideal too for organs that you want to keep intact, just do it as quickly as possible. But just remember, do not put a lot of pressure behind the fluid, because then you're going to start disruption because of that force of that fluid trying to make its way through everything, especially lung that is so delicate. All right, I hope that helps. Hope that's the answer, or at least some direction and some information that will help them get to where they're trying to go.
Absolutely. All right, now what is the correct slide thickness, or what should that be?
Correct slide thickness or section thickness? Maybe the section of the tissue?
Maybe they meant
Section of the tissue? Maybe the section. When you're grossing, right? No, nothing thicker than, we always talk about the size of a postage stamp, no thicker than a nickel. That's a little tough to get to, but as long as it's about 2 by 2 by about 0.3 to 0.4 millimeters, you will avoid the cross hatching. You're not compressing the tissue. There's plenty of space for the fluids to get in and do their job. When you're on the microtome, it depends on what you're targeting. So if you're targeting just normal H&E, IHC stuff, then you're going to cut anywhere from 4 to 5 microns, right? If you're doing lymph nodes, they're a little bit more densely cellular, so you're going to cut sections, or spleen, you're going to cut sections at about 3 to 4 microns. It does create a little bit of a challenge for those that don't cut all the time on a microtome. It's an art, right? Some days it's more of an art than a skill. And so, but yeah, 3 to 4 for those really heavy lymph nodes, spleens that have a lot of cellular, right? They're very dense with cells. And everything else is pretty much 4 to 5. If you're doing studies with brain, which a lot of research out there with brain, you're going to make those sections a little thicker. I've seen sections all the way up to 8 microns. So it just depends what you're targeting. Hope that helps.
Perfect. All right. Now, does leftover blood in tissues hamper with processing?
Leftover blood. There's been discussion historically in the laboratory about bloody specimens being stored in formalin. It can alter the pH, but it's not significant enough from the discussions I've had. When it comes to moving it through the processor, it does dirty up everything else as it goes down. So, I mean, I think it's very subjective on whether it can actually impact any kind of morphology or IHC. I am not aware of that. I just know what it can do on the front end when it comes to creating more work on the maintenance side. So if you have specimens that you can rinse off and then prep and then put in formalin, it's probably ideal, unless you're looking at specimens where you're looking at clots. For those of you that are studying vessels when it comes to any kind of clot, atherosclerosis that you're trying to preserve, then maybe, you know, doing the minimum on those type of cases. But anything else where you don't need that blood and it's just a byproduct of the process of removing it, then I certainly would try to rinse it just to keep the maintenance, keep the bottles clean, right? I think that's the biggest impact I could see that I know of.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know everything, but certainly I always have a lot of good contacts we can ask. We also have that 800 number, right? We have the 844 number at Leica that is manned by wonderful staff of people that have experience in the research world to help also. They're my go-to sometimes when I don't know.
Great. All right. Now, next question here. This user is mentioning that they're working in a donor tissue service. The tissue we receive is fresh without fixative. Can we store with Michael's fixative or 10% NBF, which is better?
So I'm a little concerned that you're getting it fresh, and I hope it's coming in refrigerated, right? That kind of slows everything down. And I'm not sure what the studies that you're looking at doing after you process the samples, but Michelle's is not, even though we call it a fixative, it's pretty much a holding solution, and it's a holding solution to preserve and keep immunoglobulins. From what I recall, I would see specimens come in a lot in Michelle's if it was for skin studies, right, to look for immunoglobulins, especially like inflammatory diseases. So my go-to for just routine histology has always been MBF. Historically, we made it up in the laboratory, and so you always want to do formaldehyde and dilute it down, make your 10%, add your phosphate buffers. You make sure that you pH it. If you're in the lab and you're making it, I believe the pH is supposed to be around 7.2. Most labs nowadays just buy it commercially, but we have seen in the space of laboratories that it's made in bulk, right, and sold in bulk. So make sure that when you open a fresh box or you open that container of MBF that you pH it, because we have seen where the pH is way off and has done some damage. And that took us a while to kind of nail down, because we had to look at every step going backwards from the time of the slide to the block, back to the processing schedule. And then finally, we discovered it was the actually commercially available MBF that was the culprit. So yeah, just make it a practice that when you open it, check the pH, make sure it's okay.
Great. Thank you.
It's been a good discussion today, Kaylee. Really enjoyed it.
Yes. Thank you to our audience for all these great questions coming in. I know we're using up a lot of time here, but we still have time for a few more. So we're going to try to squeeze them in and continue here. All right. Okay, Robin, then this next question I have for you asks if this is a problem. Tissue rinse in PBS and then fix in formalin. Is it true that the salts block the formalin?
Oh, I don't think I've ever had this type of question. I know that when you mix, when you're if you have an acid base, you're going to precipitate those salts out. That happens when, of course, when you're going from formalin to the next alcohol, if it's above 72, right? But I don't think I've ever heard of, and I've heard of people rinsing in PBS, not for a long time, like not for hours on end, but rinsing it briefly and then placing it in, and there's been not a problem. So maybe it's a time related. Like I would think that if you're doing it, or if it's at the end of the bottle, right, where you tend to see some buffers come out right at the bottom. Maybe if you left it in there a long time, but this is a new one. I don't know. I think it depends on the time, depends on the contents of the bottle. Is there a lot of buffer sitting in it? And is it circulating through that tissue? Is it a tissue that's very porous that would allow that to come in? And then I would think that with MBF, because it's only 10%, right? A lot of it's water, but it too is buffered with phosphate buffers. Then does that rinse out? I don't know. I would love to see if this customer or this attendee had a slide of an example of where that could happen. That would be very curious. I would be very interested in following up with that. See, Kaylee, I don't do these just for the audience. I do this for me too, because it's a learning experience.
Absolutely. Yes, this is great.
I love it.
Fantastic. All right. Okay, next question here. To store fixed samples, was it with 70% ethanol?
Yes. Yes. That is what I have seen throughout my tenure with Leica the last 13 years, as people store their long-term specimen storage in 70%. Yes. But that is following the MBF fixation. Like if you just put fresh tissue in your 70%, you're going to get what we call, not the cross-link feature of MBF, but you're going to get what we call coagulation fixation, right? And I know people know this, but right, when you have proteins that you're trying to capture and fix, if you throw it right into alcohol, all those hydrophilic, right, proteins that are amino acids that are sticking out are going to go inward, right? And the hydrophobic going to come outward. And so you get a denaturing, in a sense, of those proteins, and you may not want that depending on your studies. You're also going to get that shrinkage to a degree. The MBF actually kind of freeze frames the tissue, right? It does create those cross links. And if you go too far, that can be bad. But that's what we're trying to do, is create that mesh where it's preserved. And then the whole goal of the alcohols is to remove that free water. But with the exception, long-term storage, 70% that's got just enough water in it, right? It's going to help it long-term. I know I took off on a little bit of a tangent, but I want to make sure that's clear, that we're not just putting fresh tissue into 70%. Thank you, Kaylee.
Of course, and thank you for that answer. All right, Robin, it looks like we have time for one more here, so we'll wrap up after this final question. And this question asks, for how long can one leave the tissue sample, experimental rat tests, in formalin before sectioning?
Don't go over 24 hours. Yeah. So minimum, usually we like to see, when we install and support customers, we love to see more than a minimum of 6 hours, but 24 is the cutoff. And so if you can keep it in that's great. In that window. Yeah.
All right. Well, Robin, that will conclude our session for today. Do you have any final comments for our audience?
No, thank you. I mean, I have nothing else to add. I could talk all day about processing, because I think it is so true that it is the fundamental step of everything we do following that, right? IHC, ISH, whatever you're doing. And you can eliminate a lot of the problems just by getting the basics right, taking the time. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share my experience from the last 40 years that I've gleaned, nuggets and truths that I try to carry on to the next person. Thank you for attending. Really appreciate the time you've put into it. Kaylee, you're awesome. Thank you again for hosting this. And I always enjoy every time I get the pleasure of doing this. It's been great.
Well, thank you, Robin, for your time today and your important research. We would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Leica Biosystems, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Now, before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. But questions we did not have time for today, and those submitted during the on-demand period, will be addressed by our speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand, and LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event.